I will step aside, Dr. Gersh, so we may spend time and listen to a man who served in the United States House of Representatives for 30 years. And no one ever served with greater distinction. He loves his country. And when he was appointed to his present position by the President of the United States, I thought this is just about the best appointment the President could make. And I've had the pleasure of spending time with him when he came to our sister organization in Denver. It was just a wonderful, wonderful time. And he's come here today, and later on we'll go to the museum and see the exhibit that the that the National Endowment for Humanities has helped to sponsor. And I also want to note this event today is being televised. Thank you, Chris Schaefer. And before the weekend is out, it will be on YouTube. But now I would ask that you join with me in giving a special welcome to a truly, truly great American from the great Hawkeye state of Iowa, the Honorable Jim Leach.
I'm tallness challenged. Let me just begin by congratulating the museum. The announcement you just heard is extraordinary. German Expressionism, for those who don't know, is probably several centuries from now going to be considered far more meaningful than French Impressionism of the last century. This is an absolutely extraordinary gift announcement. And because there is a reference to scholar athletes, there are several scholar artists here from Nazarene. Maybe they've had to leave to go back to school. I don't know if they're still with us. Are they? Oh, here they are. And one is an abstract painter, and one is a photographer, and so we welcome you. A small reference was made to the state of Iowa, and I'm more or less Iowa-centric, so I want to make a reference to a couple of scholar athletes from my state. One's name was Niall Kinnick, who was a Phi Beta Kappa scholar and the fourth winner of the Heisman Trophy, who was killed in World War II. And he's considered one of the great heroes of the Hawkeye State. And the other was, to me, presented the greatest protest to a great university in the field of athletics. And he won a scholarship to go to the University of Chicago, where he played football. And when the University of Chicago dropped out of the Big Ten and chose to emphasize academics exclusively, he gave the first Heisman Trophy to his high school in Dubuque, Iowa. His name is Jay Berwanger. I've always thought that was if you're looking for protests, that is one of the great, wonderful protests that I can think of. But I don't want to end, because the Padres are here, without a reference to baseball. And so I want to reference a non-scholar athlete who, to me, is a great American model. Probably the greatest pitcher in the history of the major leagues, a chap named Bob Feller. And on the day of December 7th, 1941, Bob, who had joined the Cleveland Indians while in high school, in fact, in the dugout of the Cleveland Indians, was doing his high school homework. The only person probably ever brought up to the majors directly from American Legion ball. He was driving to Chicago, leaving from a small Iowa town, to Chicago, where on December 8th he was to sign his new contract with the Cleveland Indians. And because he was a ball player, he had a car, which was unusual in those days. As a young bachelor, a Ford Roadster. And also unusual, he actually had a radio in the car. And as he leaves his home county, he hears the news of Pearl Harbor. Before leaving the state of Iowa, he stopped at the town of Davenport on the Mississippi River and found a pay booth. And he called up a friend in the Pentagon. And on December 8th, 1941, at the hotel in Chicago where he was going to re-sign with the Cleveland Indians, he signed instead with the United States Navy. And so in this naval town, that's a pretty wonderful story. We all know about Ted Williams, who lost the better years of his playing career in the military. Well, Bob Feller in 1946, the year after he got out, pitched 38 games for the Cleveland Indians out of 85 games the Indians played that year. His record was 33-3. Of the 33 games, every one was a complete game. And that is an indication of A, a great athlete, but B, how much he missed these great years where country came before his career. Anyway, I'm here to talk about my field today, which is the humanities. And I'll try to do it without reference to the only truly great American sport, which is, of course, the sport of wrestling. And I apologize to my Padre compatriots. In talking about the humanities, because it's kind of an esoteric subject, let me just begin by saying, why do the humanities matter? And if you think about what really characterizes our times, or any times, it's the subject of change. And all people at all times on earth have dealt with change. That is, nobody walks the exact same steps every time. No one faces the same weather every day, unless maybe you live in San Diego. But if you say what is really symbolic of our times, it's the acceleration of change. That change is just coming so rapidly in so many different ways, and all of us are like it and are challenged by it and find it discombobulating, and yet it's with us. And maybe baseball's a little bit exception, because you still have 3 strikes and you're out, but it's all done in a little different way. In any regard, if you think of change, how does one deal with change? And basically, it means that one has to imagine a bit, and imagination becomes a really central part of all our lives. How do you stimulate the imagination? How do you go forth with dealing with the imagination? Is a very great question. One might say that the hallmark of the status quo is rote thinking. Change, on the other hand, is something of a very different dimension. Einstein once said that the imagination is more important than knowledge, which is a very imaginative thought and a brilliant one. And Einstein himself was living proof of this. That is, he's considered by many the greatest physicist of all time. But physics is a math-based discipline. And Einstein was not considered a first-tier mathematician, but he was a first-tier imaginer. And he developed thought experiments and then answered his own experiments through thought. Well, that is a very imaginative endeavor. And it's intriguing. I have met in my life and dealt with on a frequent basis Chinese diplomats and Chinese scholars. And it's interesting to me, the American that the Chinese talk the most about in awe is Einstein. How do you teach the imagination? And the Chinese now are putting much more effort into the disciplines of the humanities, which are things like history, literature, philosophy, related disciplines, after a period of time in which these kinds of thoughts were verboten because if you get into imaginative thinking, you get away from the discipline of a state. And they've gone through a very disciplined period. In fact, if you think of another country, Iran, for example, Ahmadinejad has tried to close down humanities disciplines to allow only the teaching of anything that is approved by the state and nothing that isn't. And the humanities are basically open-ended in many kinds of ways and are really aimed at free thinking and imaginative thinking. A skeptic once said that he thought the humanities were little more than studies of flaws in human nature. Actually, they uplift on the one hand and warn on the other. And for example, the power of a very few people to do societal destruction, as well as the power of a very few people to create very extraordinary constructive things, has never been greater in human history. And that is what we've seen with example after example, whether on the negative side, events like 9/11, whether on the positive side, the great inventiveness that's associated with the state of California. And we're very proud, for example, that an Iowan is the co-inventor of the chip and founded a company called Intel. I like to be Iowa-centric in my commentary, in case you haven't noticed. If you think of the humanities, my institution is called the National Endowment for the Humanities. Basically supports historic research and also research into things like literature and philosophy-related disciplines. There are also 50 state humanities councils, of which Californians is one of the preeminent that put on programs throughout the state. In fact, from a grant from our national office, which I had to the humanities councils a year ago on civility, they're now going to put on 500 events statewide this year dealing with the subject of democracy, its challenges, and what we can do in the future. This is a really terrific state initiative in which is going to reach out not to a few people, but a few million people, which is rather intriguing. And so what your National Endowment for the Humanities is the largest humanities research organization in the world and the most effective humanities outreach organization in the world, with over 50,000 programs put on a yearly basis.